Hi all, there was another fantastically instructive game in the Tatar Stil tournaments played in Kingside, the Netherlands. Magnus Carlsen was playing white. He's currently rated 2862 and of course is the current world chess champion, men's world chess champion. I say that because he was playing against Yifan, the current women's world champion, 2673. So the clash of the world champions. Magnus kicked off with e4 and we saw a fighting response, the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, knight c6, open Sicilian d4. Hou Yifan takes this and we have a quick e5. So this is a relative of the Sicilian Sveshnikov, which is knight f6, encouraging white to play knight c3. And you'll notice in the Sicilian Sveshnikov with e5 that white has committed that knight to c3 and blocked the c-pawn. Here in relatives of this with the quicker e5, this is not always the case. In fact, black here didn't try and prompt knight c3 but played d6, slightly different strategy. Black has still potentially compromised d5. From a structural point of view, d5 has been slightly compromised, but it's not so clear because often black gets dynamic play. White has in particular potential dark square weaknesses. If black can exchange this bishop for this bishop, that's the usual strategy for black, to emphasize the dark square weaknesses. But this does allow white to set up a positional bind, c4. So how dangerous or harmless will this bind be? It's a classic Maroczy bind against that d5. So in theory, structurally, you might have doubts about this, accepting the backward pawn and the bind, but in practice the results are often very good for black as a fighting opening. So Kalashnikov, bishop e7, then knight 1 to c3. This knight can reroute like this and get back to the center to control things like d5 or if5. a6, knight a3, bishop e6, knight c2, and now this classic exchange of the dark square bishop before playing knight f6. So this is by far the most common move here, this strategic exchange of the dark square bishops. Bishop e2, white would also like to potentially exchange off in the future, as long as c4 is not dropping off, under the right conditions, the light square bishops to try and weaken black on the light squares. So the square strategy is pretty clear cut, but throwing the mix, the backward pawn and this clamp on d5, white potentially has a long-term bind and maybe extra mobility to exploit. Let's see what happened now. So bishop takes c1, rook takes, now the knight develops, Magnus castles, black castles, queen d2, keeps central, keeps eyeing d6 this move, queen b6. Now okay, if d6 is taken, this is unnecessary complication. White wants to sit on this positional bind and try and provoke weaknesses, concessions for black to try and play actively and maybe create some potential issues. For the moment, black's dark square grip is evident. Exchanging off that dark square bishop means d4 has been significantly weakened and there's nothing to kick anything from d4, so that is kind of one of black's positional trump cards, that d4 square to make use of here. And you see the queen just eyeing d4 like that. But also b2 is not really threatened at the moment. With this next move, Magnus avoids any complexities with queen takes d6 and actually just plays rook fd1, just keeping the pressure. The pawn is immune here. If taking, then rook b1 actually traps the queen because the knight's covering a3. So rook fd1 keeping solid. So it's a good looking position with the bind, but how does white actually win this with this positional bind? And I think that's why this game is very instructive. What does Magnus do actually to try and use this advantage in theory? So rook fd8, protecting the pawn now officially, b3 protecting b2 officially by moving. So h6, depriving the queen of the g5 square. h3, and you might think with white's dark square weakness is slightly compromised, this f4 square could be useful for black in the future. If a knight ever got to f4, then as usual it would be difficult to kick it with g3 with this pawn. But h3 does support positional ideas. For example, bishop g4 later might be supported. So queen a7, keeping a pin on the f pawn, keeping an eye on d4. So black for the moment is pretty solid looking. Bishop f3, strengthening the grip on d5. Knight e7, as though a knight is heading actually for f4 potentially here. Knight e3. Now here the knight is looking at both d5 and f5. It doesn't look so clear if the knight can usefully go to g6. In fact, now white has a pleasant position here. In fact, a kind of indecisive looking move is played here. The knight kind of just goes back looking at d4 again. So black's played a waiting game, doesn't want to commit to trying to put a knight on f4. Just keeping that eye on d4. That is still remains the key square for black in this position after the exchange of the dark square bishops. But here Magnus plays a very interesting move positionally. Even though there's knight eyeing g4, he plays bishop g4, so this is not necessarily going to trade off the light squared bishops. Now if black did play knight takes g4, then hg, this is a very nice knight outpost with knight f5 coming up, which is difficult to kick the knight. As we've seen in reverse, it'd be difficult to kick a knight on f5 with g6 with that pawn on h6. And it'll be eyeing d6 as well as the kingside. So that wasn't played actually. So in this position, Yifan played knight d4, just ignoring it. And of course, exchanging with the bishop does weaken the light squares considerably, so that will be in white's kind of strategy for the position, to try and weaken black on the light squares. So it was just ignore knight d4. Now Magnus has this interesting decision. Does he really want to fix black's structural weakness here? These are the very difficult dynamic decisions often faced in chess. You have to look at the pros and cons of such decisions structurally, because it is in theory a classic d5 weakness, not held structurally by a pawn, but Magnus does play bishop takes e6, nevertheless allowing black the option now of bringing a pawn to the center and controlling d5. That would seem in theory a dream option. So why has Magnus done this? Well, actually, the bishop wasn't actually doing that much inside this pawn chain. It's a bit of a prison for the bishop. So it's not the best bishop in terms of the pawn structure. The double pawns here are potentially less mobile. And in fact, from a theoretical angle, there is a downside of this structure, that in the future, maybe c5 helps undermine e5 and leave raw double pawns. So c5 break in the future is very, very dangerous for this structure. We see knight c2 immediately challenging that knight on d4, and knight takes c2, rook takes c2. So we're left with this bind, but black may be a little bit delicate, because there is these double pawns could be exposed more with later c5. Rook d7 for the moment. Things are kept solid. Queen e2. So any possibility of d5 seems totally out of the question. Rook a d8. And here is a very instructive moment. White has an advantage of the bind, but how to use it. Black's clearly not going to be creating weaknesses voluntarily. So another way of trying to use this advantage of the positional bind is try and make use of the extra piece mobility that the pawn structure offers white compared to black. There is extra mobile rooks here for white with this structure, and this is demonstrated simply by this move rook d3. Black cannot do the same thing to attack white's king, but this rook can actually switch quite conveniently to attack black's king. That is kind of showing as though not just the bind, but the kind of space advantage, because you usually associate extra mobility like this to be able to switch from one side to the other with a space advantage. The pawn structure is a little bit passive compared to white's, which controls d5 but also lets the rooks swing on the third rank. And yes, this backward pawn has really damaged the rook activity on d6. It is kind of a passive backward pawn with both rooks being passive. So white has the extra rook mobility and the extra piece freedom even though visibly it doesn't look like a huge space advantage, but it's a bind which is causing piece passivity and lack of mobility here. So this is a classic recipe you'd use even if you had a space advantage. Often you try and go for the king because you have that advantage to make use of it. Sometimes you have to go for it if the opponent is not creating weaknesses or concessions voluntarily. It's a classic idea that you can start to go for the king. So queen c5. Now here the knight kicks the queen, and does the queen want to go back to a dark square? Well, maybe white would be playing for c5 later. In fact, we see queen c6 keeping an eye on e4 here. So black is trying to distract white from the kingside operations and keep central pressure going. So rook e3. For the moment d5 is still completely unplayable. We see the move now b6, and now an interesting maneuver. So white's a bit tied down, not as free as he'd hoped for with this pressure on e4. Knight b2, which spells out the idea that maybe knight d3, and then to b4 would be forking the queen and pawn here. That would be potentially dangerous or causing some problems. Rook f7, as though this f file might be useful for black. Rook d2, knight d7, and now we see this knight d3. So here there's an idea of knight b4, which in this particular position now is also going to be looking at d6, piling the pressure on d6 potentially. So the queen is in danger of being evicted from her central influence. So a slight concession, a5, to protect against knight b4. Now knight b2. Magnus is not in a hurry, so he's doing these interesting knight maneuvers. So where is the knight going now? Knight c5, keeping an eye on e4. Knight d1. The knight could head for the delicate b5 square. That has been compromised. Rook d f8. So as though two rooks with queen is on the cards, but that's taken out with indirect defense here as a possibility. Rook d8. Black remains tied up. So these are the sort of situations where you might have also it's the same sort of strategy as a space advantage. Try and take it easy, do some maneuvering, seeing if the opponent's going to create any concessions. At the moment, yeah, b5 is a bit weak looking. Knight c3, emphasizing reinforcing control of b5 and d5. Rook fd7. Queen d1, still taking it easy, putting some pressure on d6. It looks as though knight b5 though is potentially on the cards to be a nuisance. Knight a6. Here, if the Anakine's gun is temporarily constructed, it's interrupted, I think, with knight b4, so that will be a nuisance. So we see queen h5 actually. White does not bother with a move like knight b5. You might think, well, the backward d6 pawn, but I think black has adequate defensive resources here. The knight can actually go to c5, perhaps, to stop rook d3. Maybe that's a key option. So Magnus puts some pressure now on the king side again. Time is right, but he's still got the bind against d5. The rooks are still more mobile than black's rooks. Knight c7. And now a concrete threat, rook g3. The concrete threat is queen takes h6. Black sidesteps that with king h8. Now rook d3. Where are these rooks going? Are they going to coordinate with each other to intensify the pressure on black's little pawn structure here, the g7 and h6 pawns? Rook e7, in fact they do now. Rook g6. This move is quite clever defensively, allowing queen e8 now. So pinning for the moment, and it's protected by this rook, so there's no little trick to try and win the black queen here. Rook dg3. But it is getting a bit dangerous to have to factor in rook takes h6 in this position. Here we see rook dd7, so this has to be carefully calculated if this is playable. Okay, so here now we see knight d1. So yes, it looks as though Magnus has committed himself to some sort of kingside attack, but the knight would be useful to do something with the knight here. But what exactly? So there's a lot of pressure on black's position. Rook f7 now actually does threaten rook f6, because that knight is not so bad protecting the queen. It supports the idea of rook f6 using the pin. So Magnus gets out of that potential rook f6 issue by retreating the queen. So yes, it seems as though some probing operations so far. But now this f4 square, white is generally weak on the dark squares, that is made use of with rook f4. Queen e3, eyeing b6 pawn, but also looking at h6 as well. It seems a very nice square for the queen in the circumstances, with two targets on both sides of the board, which could be very useful. So is black getting tied down? Because this is looking dangerous on both sides. We see the move b5. Now here, I mean, it'll be looking ridiculous to play a move like this. You don't really want to put a knight on the corner, it would be useless there. Knight c3, white's got pronounced positional advantage and can still go in for b6 anyway with knight a4. So this b5 seems logical. Knight b2, rook d f7, and now Magnus ignores the f2 pawn. He actually plays c5, trying to dent this pawn structure. If you remember earlier, one of the downsides theoretically of this structure is the double pawns could be more exposed if c5 broke down this structure a little bit more, and that's happening now. c5 is happening now. So what does black do? Well, queen c6 was played. If rook takes f2, then this gets pretty nasty actually, because actually we've also got the queen eyeing h6. So this variation is c takes, rook takes. White has much stronger than taking on c7 here. White could actually, can you see what white could do in this position, which would be devastating? As an example, if I give you 5 seconds. Okay, rook takes g7 will be crushing here, threatening queen takes h6, stronger than taking the knight there. This is just absolutely winning. End of game, like this, mating. So black has to be very, very careful here. Can't really take on f2 in this position. So yeah, queen c6 looks more sensible, looking at e4. Knight d3, protecting c5, putting pressure on e5 and hitting the rook. So a very interesting position here, very tense. Now in this position b4 was played. If we look at various options for black, if queen takes e4, it seems the best move in this position, if this had occurred, would be c takes d6, just undermining e5. That structure is very vulnerable here. So for example like this, white would be clearly better and winning the exchange temporarily there. But e5 is now dropping. That's the point here. This is a massive advantage with the passed pawn. So that kind of thing is horrible for black, where these double pawns are kind of exposed. So yeah, queen takes e4 doesn't seem that palatable because of this c takes d6 stuff. Another idea, rook takes e4, fails tactically. Can you see why? If I give you 5 seconds. Okay, rook takes h6. Yeah, if taking that's like mating, of course. But if not taking, it's still really dangerous, this position. After queen g5, this is a very dangerous position with queen h5 on the cards for rook h8. And black is really tied down here. You know, e5 is also vulnerable to that knight on d3. So black doesn't really want that position. So here, the move b4 seems like a lesser evil move compared to those two, taking on e4 with either queen or rook. We see now queen e2, and now again some very interesting possibilities. Here, queen takes e4, knight takes f4 works quite well. Better than previously, actually much better than previously. Any check, just king moves. I mean, white's just won the exchange and protecting the queen. Previously, by the way, this wasn't so hot. If you're wondering about knight takes f4 here, there was queen check here, and then e takes f4, forking queen and rook, and black's close to equalizing there. So yeah, but now after this move b4 queen e2, yeah, queen takes e4. Now there's knight takes f4, rook takes e4. If we look at that again, if white is leaving e4 or not, there's queen h5 here. This is very, very dangerous. This position is like a temporary positional or attacking pawn sacrifice for a crushing initiative. This is just intolerable for black, this kind of position. The attack would be crashing through. Just, yeah, black's king will be ripped apart. So yes, it seems the e pawn is again immune, even after queen e2, again immune to both rook takes and queen takes. But also, furthermore, queen h5 is dangerous for things like rook takes h6. So rook h4 defends against queen h5, taking away pressure from e4 though. Now rook 6 to g4, exchanging off a pair of rooks. Rook takes, queen takes. Now here the move king g8 is played, which strengthens the rook. It's not a loose piece anymore. Queen h5, threatening queen takes h6. And here actually, knight b5, ignoring queen takes h6, because actually queen takes e4 would be very good here. If queen takes h6, queen takes e4. So for the moment, Magnus actually here protects g4. Now knight c3, and this is a very tense point of the game. I think both players in severe time trouble. A very tense point in the game, but yeah, it seems black's play has been really good actually to put pressure on e4 all the time. Magnus plays queen takes h6, and guess what black plays? What would you play with black if I give you 5 seconds to think about this position? There's actually an amazing resource which could have been a very good attempt to try and hold the balance here with black. That was kind of missed actually in the game. If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, I wonder if you can spot it. So black's play. Okay, the amazing resource would have been queen takes e4. Taking with the queen, yeah. This position is probably the best try. So for example, taking, check. Maybe black can just about have, you know, well, minimizing any disadvantage in this position. Yeah, you know, less than half a pawn advantage technically from an engine perspective. But yeah, in this position, knight takes e4 was played, which is not as good now. There's specific technical reasons. Well, obviously e6, it looks pretty tasty to take on e6, but what about f2, you might ask? Well, there's a punchline here. Queen takes e6 not only pins d6, there's 2 pins that have been set up against the queen, but it also pins the rook against the king. Now, Yifan played knight takes f2 here. This is a bad position now in any case. But can you see what Magnus played in this position, which is really quite crushing? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video now. Okay, knight takes e5. This is much stronger than, for example, knight takes f2. Let's have a quick look at that. Queen takes as a nasty pin here. But even in this position, white is technically better. Still better for white, but what Magnus played is stronger, much stronger. By playing knight takes e5, he's using both pins, in fact, simultaneously. And the king, his king is temporarily defended by black's own knight. There's no check or anything. Black tried knight takes h3 check. Now, if the routine g takes, then queen takes check is useful for black to try and get, well, actually black's better there. So that's to be avoided. No, Magnus just plays king h2, maintaining that pin on d6 and this pin and winning material. Black has had it here. It's a terrible position, losing lots of material. So black resigned. What can black do? There's nothing to do here. There's no checks or anything which are useful. So it was a very interesting game conceptually for how someone, with the binds, how the binds can be used. And it seems some of the same methods that you use with a space advantage, you try potentially to try and just wait for weaknesses. Black's strategy is well defined from the opening. This is a well defined theoretical strategy to exchange off the dark square bishops, because this dark square bishop otherwise is a kind of prisoner in the structure to that backward pawn. So not only is it getting it out of gel, it's also weakening white on the dark squares, some key dark squares, which Yifan Hou for a lot of the game was making great use of, to her great credit. So we saw this bind, this long-term bind, and now not necessarily indecisive, but just waiting actually to see what white's plan here is with knight c6, keeping contact with the most important strategical point in the position. So very good play from both sides. Very interesting, you might think controversial decision, because you think that the hole on d5 is something to preserve, but sometimes you can get more exploitable weaknesses by apparently fixing one of the opponent's weaknesses but making it more exploitable in the future. It seems that the structure for the moment looks pretty steady, but the knight on d4 can be immediately challenged, and after that the structure is prone to a later c5 break. This always has to be borne in mind, that this structure can be torn apart literally with c5 later, and that's kind of what happens. But black created some good pressure in the center, so these probing knight maneuvers, so great positional play from Magnus, creating some extra weakness here as a concession at last with a5, and then the knight coming back, maneuvering as though b5 is going to be used. And now this queen d1 flexible switch to the kingside, so probing kingside with some concrete threats now for a moment being generated. For the moment easy to parry. And then there's a kind of repulsion here with this queen e8, black resourcefully setting up potentially against this pin with the idea of coming to f6. So it kind of repulsed the queen back. So that first wave of attack didn't seem to achieve anything, so this is at move 41. And black encouraged to move forward to take that f4 square. But now the queen coming to e3 is again looking at both sides of the board here. b5. Slight concession, you might think, actually, when this was played, because it does mean that theoretical c5 to break up the structure is available for white. So I guess, yes, this idea of creating concessions and attacking has been mixed together by Magnus as a continuous process, either trying to maneuver, create concessions, or trying to go for a direct attack to create concessions. So either wait to get it or try and get some concessions. But to here, yes, structurally now, the structural attack in this phase of the game with c5 puts black under severe pressure, but black counteracts very well. In fact, Yifan has subtly taken advantage of this c5 for later, putting pressure on e4, very resourcefully coming down with b4, knight b5. Very resourceful play from both sides, in fact. So black really giving a good fight to Magnus. But here, tactically, it's failing. Things are failing tactically in this position for taking on e4. But b4 does support this, strong rerouting maneuver for the knight to have a central influence on e4. And it's because of this there were some very real chances to get right back in the game, even at the point of Magnus's seemingly dangerous queen takes h6. Right here, there's a climax of the game, the knight hitting that central pawn, which would liberate black's position. And yes, the resource queen takes e4 seems as though black's getting close to equalising. You could claim less than half pawn advantage, but knight takes e4, black just crumbled after queen takes e6. The tactics do not favour black with the two pins here. This is a very bad position indeed, with knight takes e5 on the cards. So knight takes f2, knight takes e5 is crushing. After knight takes, yes, black is helpless. Very interesting example game of playing with the binds, and some sort of counterintuitive decisions like fixing black's d5, but there's downsides which are picked up on by both sides, to be fair. So this is a really high level fighting game, but I think exacerbated a bit by an inaccuracy from black. So black got done in the end tactically. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.